gal, and welcome back to the channel. We are finishing up the discussion of Lord Dunmore's War today. Don't forget, if you have missed any of those videos, I do have a playlist putting them all together in order, and I will link that right up here for you. In this video, we are going to finally talk about the Treaty at Fort Pitt in 1775. This is something that I don't know why, but it seems like a lot of retellings of Dunmore's War just kind of end with Camp Charlotte, and we never get to the treaty. But first, before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of gossiping. The Fort Gower resolves that we talked about in the last video, they include a compliment of sorts for Lord Dunmore. The officers state that they have no reason to think he acted in anything but their best interests. And did they really think that? Apparently he was a pretty great guy during the march. He marched on foot next to them. He didn't ask for any special treatment. Overall, I have no doubt that as a person, these guys, they liked him. I don't know if the statement in the resolves was more of a formality, trying to stay on his good side so he wouldn't stop them from publishing these resolves, or what it is. But there's still a lot more going on kind of in the periphery. He certainly did not give Parliament any warning about the Fort Gower resolves. As I mentioned before, the Marquis of Rockingham had to bring that up. But that doesn't mean he was happy about it either. And when Dunmore got back to Williamsburg, he had some damage control to do. As a mom, I kind of want to make a joke about, and say that Pennsylvania tattled on Lord Dunmore. But there were some serious concerns, it goes beyond tattling. Lord Dartmouth had written to Dunmore and challenged him about the conflict with the Shawnee and what caused it. Dartmouth brought up everything he'd been hearing about Captain Connolly's questionable behavior, and he notes that these accounts were confirmed through multiple channels. So basically he's saying, you have some explaining to do, dude. And this is kind of where I want to call it tattling, because with kids, you'd be like, well, who did this? Who did that? And the answer is always, not me, wasn't me. I can make a reference to the Shaggy song as well there. But that's essentially what Dunmore does at this point. He throws everyone else under the bus. It was the fault of the American Indians. It was the fault of the frontier Virginians. It was the Pennsylvanians. Excuses, excuses, excuses. And the one thing that Dunmore is quite clear on in his response is it's not his fault. Anyone else but him. Meanwhile, in Virginia, people are whispering about things that they've learned, things that they found suspicious. Some said that there were American Indians who were with Cornstalk at Point Pleasant, who just a day or two before had been at Fort Gower in Dunmore's company. How does that work? Does that mean Dunmore encouraged them to attack? Captain John Stewart, he was thinking about the conversation he had the night before the battle with Indian trader William McCulloch, and how it didn't make any sense. And then later, this is a ways down the road, but in his memoirs, Stewart also says a book was published where the author claimed to have been with the Southern Division on their expedition, but the name of the author was not anyone who was present. So maybe this person just made it up, but then again, they seem to have details. So at this point, Stewart's sitting here thinking, maybe this person was, quote, incog and a creature of Lord Dunmore, end quote. So when the American Revolution began, the colonists were extremely divided on the topic of independence. But when we look at those who fought in Dunmore's War specifically, we see an army that was extremely pro-independence. Governor Dunmore excluded, of course. Of the officers who were part of the Fort Gower resolves, Colonel Adam Stephen was supposed to go be part of the First Continental Congress, but he thought that the Indian War had to take priority. And people later recalled that Dunmore knew good and well that revolution was coming. This was something that was actually discussed on the Northern Division's march. So at that point, it didn't seem like such a stretch to believe that, maybe he was purposefully trying to weaken the revolutionary-minded colonists. I do want to caution you when I say that, though. I am not asserting Dunmore had that design for certain. It is not proven. I'm talking about the rumors that were going on and why the colonists may have thought this. Another claim, which I found in the Virginia Gazette, was that Dunmore had bought over 3 pounds worth of gunpowder per man in the Northern Division, but then he only marched with, quote, less than a gill of powder a man, end quote. A gill, which is actually spelled with a G, is about one quarter of an imperial pint. So I really have to shout out to the page Black Powder Shooting and Reenacting on Facebook. You should go check them out. I reached out to him about this quote because I wanted some context. It kind of goes with the whole not being a military historian. I don't really know anything about black powder. So he helped me kind of reinforce what I thought I understood about this quote. Essentially, it appears that this would have been about enough for 20 rounds, give or take, and not even enough to fill a powder horn per man. And what's really interesting about these powder claims is how it illustrates one of the many ways that Dunmore's war and the American Revolution can kind of overlap. Because we have to ask ourselves, did Dunmore really buy all this powder and then not take it? Was there really something shisty going on there? Or did this rumor start because of the gunpowder incident, rather than because of what happened on the march? The gunpowder incident occurred on April 21st of 1775, about 6 months after the Battle of Point Pleasant and 2 days after the battles of Lexington and Concord. So it's early morning hours, and Dunmore, he orders all the gunpowder in the powder magazine in Williamsburg moved and loaded onto a British Navy ship. So Virginians were outraged when they figured out what was going on, and they demanded an explanation. I may have to do a longer video on this later just to get that whole story. But basically, Dunmore does not acknowledge the likely reason behind his actions, and it's likely, right, that he feared Virginians overall would rebel because of what was going on up in Massachusetts. But no, in the typical vein of his excuses, he says that it's because there's a rumored slave uprising nearby, so he has to move the powder to protect Virginia. And this is at the same time, mind you, that Dunmore is writing to Lord Dartmouth. And, Virginians don't know this yet, but he is writing to Lord Dartmouth, and he is asking for additional weapons so that he can arm, quote, Indians, Negroes, and other persons, end quote, in order to control Virginia in case he needs to suppress an insurrection. So, talk about irony there. With all of this going on, it made it difficult for Dunmore to make it back to Fort Pitt to conclude that treaty, right? And everyone was noticing this problem. Reports came from the frontier saying that the Shawnee and the Ohio Haudenosaunee, they're anxious to make the peace official, partly because, according to rumor, there were Pennsylvanians spreading stories about how the Virginians were going to come back with another army and slaughter the tribes, basically. But the tribes also had the motivation of wanting their people back, who were being held as hostages pending this treaty. So to buy time, Dunmore sends back one of the Shawnee hostages, and that was Captain Morgan, or Wasikapawe, is my guess on pronunciation. Connolly was also asking what he was supposed to be doing with the Ohio Haudenosaunee hostages that were still at Fort Pitt. And the House of Burgesses, they decided to appoint their own representatives to go finish the treaty because it needed to be done. So while everything is being prepared to do this, they send Captain James Wood to visit with the tribes and invite them to Fort Pitt for the treaty proceedings that they schedule in September. This is almost a year after Point Pleasant and Camp Charlotte, mind you, so this has taken some time. And when Wood arrives, he discovers that the Shawnee and 16 other tribes have received wampum from the British at Detroit. And this is basically a message to try to convince the tribes to join the British against the rebellious colonists. So this is just shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord that they would have had to have taken this action. The Shawnee, though, they're committed to peace at this point. Cornstalk still holds sway, and he's determined to maintain it. But by the time that Wood gets there, they do have another reason for concern. And that's because just a couple days before, another of the Shawnee hostages, Chinasaw, who's called the Judge, he had just gotten back and he believed that he had been fleeing for his life from Williamsburg. It's kind of like a whole confused situation. From his perspective, not fully understanding the language or the people of Virginia or what's going on politically, Chinasaw thought he saw Virginians preparing for war against the Shawnee, and he thought that Governor Dunmore was the only one on their side. That last bit kind of makes me wonder what Dunmore was telling him, but anyway, Chinasaw had escaped, or so he thought, after learning, and again, this is just going based on what he thought was going on, but after learning that the Virginians intended to make him and the other hostages into slaves, put them on a ship off for another country to go spend their life in servitude. And he also believed that in the course of his escape, that another one of the hostages had been killed. So that had to have been just a terrifying journey for him back home to what we call Ohio from Williamsburg, Virginia. Well, at this point, Captain Wood, he asked for a chance to tell the Virginian side of the story. And in it, he promises the Shawnee that Chenisaw's fears were unfounded. That's not what happened. He explains the nature of the dispute with Great Britain, and he says, look, that's the war that he saw us preparing for. We're not preparing to go to war with y'all. We're preparing to go to war with Great Britain. After Chinasaw ran, the Virginians had apparently sent out letters, in various directions, telling fellow colonists that if they saw Chinasaw, to be nice to him and just let him continue on his way. The remaining hostages, the Wolf and Niwa, would meet up with them at Fort Pitt to, return home to their families after those treaty negotiations. And they were also bringing along Chenisaw's belongings that he left behind him in Williamsburg in his rush to get out of there. The Shawnee replied, quote, "We are fully satisfied with what you have told us and hope you will not think hard of us for his bad behavior," end quote. And truly, I feel bad for Chinasaw having to make that whole journey thinking that he was running for his life. Then in September of 1775, Cornstalk and Andrew Lewis, they meet again because now they are both representatives of their people at Fort Pitt for those treaty negotiations. Others present include Thomas Walker, James Wood, who had gone to speak with the tribes, and Adam Stephen of Virginia. Lewis Morris of New York, he was there. He had been appointed by Congress as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And there's also James Wilson of Pennsylvania. So this isn't just Virginia talking to the tribes, it is the colonies as a group meeting with the tribes as a slightly smaller group, and they're trying to plan for peace, not just to end Dunmore's war, although that's officially the reason, but also because they really want to have peace moving forward when they know they're about to be engaged in a war with a completely different enemy. So for the American Indians, the records list Kiashoda, I still don't know how that's properly pronounced, White Mingo and Flying Crow of the Ohio Haudenosaunee. We have Costalaga, Captain Pipe, and Captain White Eyes of the Lenape, and there's also representatives of the Ottawa and the Wyandot. So those are the tribes represented that we know of. Speaking of White Eyes, the United Colonies were not the only ones announcing a change in the power structure here. And I find this to be one of the most interesting parts of the records we have of these treaty negotiations. Because Captain White Eyes, he takes the initiative to speak before the Haudenosaunee get a chance to. And he announces that the Lenape, the Wyandot, the Shawnee, and the Ottawa have joined together. Essentially, they are asserting their independence from the Haudenosaunee and the Covenant chain, which is an exciting move for them and their future. And I kind of needed to geek out for a second and tell y'all that part because I think that's a big deal. As far as the negotiations themselves, the biggest issue is the return of captives. The Shawnee had already returned people and property, but everyone knew that there were more among the Shawnee. And this had happened after Pontiac's War II, where everyone knew that there were further adopted captives among them. But the British Indian agents just kind of eventually gave up after a while and just left it alone, said forget about it. So as much as Cornstalk, he sincerely wanted peace. I mean, we can tell by his actions that he really did want peace. But as much as he wanted that, he didn't want to force people to return to Virginia if they didn't want to. This is really hard for him. And he explains that, first of all, we already know that there were many who were adopted who didn't want to go back to white civilization. That's not abnormal. Maybe they were the minority overall, because most captives would, they would either be killed or they would get redeemed rather quickly. But we know that there were plenty who did choose to stay. But Cornstalk, when he's explaining this hesitation, he says it's a particularly hard thing to ask of the Shawnee to return many of these captives, because when it's a black person being returned, they're being returned to slavery. Or if they're being asked to return the children of these black people, who are perhaps the children of black and American Indian parents, all of them are going to be returning to Virginia in order to be slaves. And it's one thing if you're asking the Shawnee to return these people to go back to their other families and live out their lives and have a happy life, But a lot of these, you're asking them to be sent to slavery, which may not seem like a big deal if you don't know a lot about American Indian culture, because you're thinking, well, aren't they the prisoners of the Shawnee? No. At this point, they have been adopted into the tribe. They are considered one of them. They live as one of them, as part of their Shawnee families. So this is a big deal to insist on this. But after some back and forth, the Shawnee offered to let representatives of the Virginians come into their towns and look for the captives that they believed were there. And the Virginians are like, well, we're not really familiar with your towns, so we're not going to hold our breath that we'll even be able to find these people, even though we're sure they're there. So Kiyoshuda of the Haudenosaunee, he steps in, maybe trying to keep that leadership role that the Haudenosaunee are used to. And he says that he doesn't think the Virginians have asked for anything that's unreasonable, anything they don't have a right to. And he offers to send his own men into the Shawnee towns to look for these additional people and property that need to be returned. And then White Eyes speaks up again, and it just makes me chuckle because he is just so blunt and honest here. I love it. He goes, quote, "I, for my part, do not love to speak lies. My young men may go to the towns, but I am sure they will bring nothing back with them, as I have not heard my grandchildren, the Shawnee, promise their brethren to deliver up what belonged to them," end quote. So, in the end, it was Niwa, Cornstalk's brother, who promised on behalf of the Shawnee to relinquish anyone or anything that belonged to Virginia. Representatives from Virginia, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Shawnee traveled to the towns to look around and retrieve them, and headsman Kiyoshuda of the Haudenosaunee and Captain Pipe of the Lenape, they also travel with this group just to make sure everything's taken care of. Cornstalk likely was not happy about this outcome, but he did continue to work to maintain peace. That was the important goal for him, and he continued to work towards it. The Treaty of Fort Pitt, it was completed on October 21st of 1775, and that is the real end of Lord Dunmore's war. So thank you so much for hanging in there with me through all these videos that I've put out on this topic. I still may do some more videos on content kind of related to these, but this is the main story. Please let me know your thoughts below. Like and subscribe to support the channel. I greatly appreciate it. Because I am getting ready to move, it may be a couple weeks before I get another video done. I'm not sure. I will try to keep it from being too long, but we'll see. So thanks again, and I will see y'all in the next video.